teacher forces black girl to play piano to mock her, but her piano talent silences him. Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories. The gates of Willow Ridge Academy stood tall and imposing under the warm morning sun, their grandeur reflecting the prestige of one of Virginia's most elite schools. Expensive cars glided smoothly into the parking lot, their shiny exteriors catching the light as students, dressed in perfectly tailored outfits, stepped out with a confident air, their designer bags swinging carelessly by their sides. Laughter echoed across the marble-paved courtyard, a place where the wealthy and privileged came together, their camaraderie built on years of shared experiences and untold advantages. But amidst the sea of affluence, Alyssa Carter stepped off the old, creaky school bus, the rubber soles of her worn-out sneakers softly tapping against the pavement. Her backpack, frayed at the edges, hung loosely on her shoulders, and with every step, she could feel the weight of the stares that followed her. No one turned to greet her. No one gave her a second glance. Alyssa didn't belong to this world. She didn't belong to Willow Ridge. The polished world around her felt like an entirely different dimension, one where wealth, power, and status ruled, and she was just another shadow passing by unnoticed. Her worn shoes and plain clothes made her invisible here, while the other girls flaunted their brand name outfits. Alyssa had nothing but the quiet hum of her dreams to keep her company. No lavish home waited for her at the end of the school day. No chauffeur-driven car to pick her up. Instead, she would return to her modest apartment, where her mother, Monica Carter, would still be toiling away at the hospital, sacrificing her energy and time just to make sure they could survive. But Alyssa didn't need luxury or designer brands. What she had was something far more powerful, a love for music. A love so fierce that it drowned out the cruel voices that echoed around her. A love that kept her going even when the world seemed determined to make her feel small. Alyssa Carter wasn't a name that commanded attention at Willow Ridge Academy. Her clothes weren't perfectly pressed. Her hair didn't shine with the perfection of the other girls. And her life wasn't defined by privilege. Unlike Madison Harrington, the epitome of elegance and status, who glided through the halls with her designer outfits, flawless makeup, and golden smile, Alyssa barely made a ripple in the sea of wealth that surrounded her. Madison was more than just popular, she was an icon. The daughter of a powerful family whose influence stretched across politics and finance. She was accustomed to power, to having everything she wanted, to controlling the narrative around her. And Alyssa? Well, she was an anomaly in Madison's polished world, a stain on the perfect picture. Madison's voice rang out across the courtyard as Alyssa walked by, cold and laced with disdain. Look, it's the scholarship girl, she sneered, her eyes gleaming with mockery. I wonder if she even has enough money for breakfast today. Her friends snickered, and Alyssa could hear the cruel, venomous laughter that followed, like sharp knives slicing through her skin. Maybe she'll beg at church again, like she always does, one of Madison's friends added, a twisted sense of amusement in her tone. Alyssa bit her lip, her heart sinking, but she didn't stop walking. The sting of their words had become familiar by now, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. In a place like Willow Ridge, money wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was the very foundation of identity. Those who had it ruled, and those who didn't, they were invisible, dismissed, and forgotten. But Alyssa had learned long ago that silence could be a shield. Being ignored was far better than being humiliated, and so she kept her head down and pressed forward, walking past the groups of laughing students, desperately trying to disappear into the shadows of the grand school she didn't belong to. At the end of each school day, while her classmates drove off to their mansions or dined at lavish restaurants, Alyssa Carter found herself boarding a modest, rickety bus, her worn sneakers tapping against the cracked pavement as she headed back to the small apartment she shared with her mother. It wasn't much, but it was home. Their apartment, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, was modest, small rooms, a single kitchen, and furniture that had seen better days. But despite the worn-out appearance, it was always warm, filled with the love and sacrifices of Monica Carter, her mother, who worked long hours at the hospital. Alyssa's mother had always been exhausted when she came home, but she never failed to greet Alyssa with a smile. No matter how weary she was, Alyssa could see the dark circles under her mother's eyes, the strain of sleepless nights, and the toll of hard work that never seemed to end. Monica's tired hands would still make a hot meal for her, a small gesture that meant everything, especially when Alyssa knew how much her mother had to sacrifice just to make ends meet. As they sat down to dinner in their small kitchen, Monica would always ask, "How was school today, sweetheart?" Her voice was kind, despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on her. But Alyssa would simply respond with, "Same as usual, Mom," brushing away the frustration and hurt from the day. It was always the same, being ignored, mocked, or left to feel like she didn't belong. The wealth of Willow Ridge felt like a world apart from her own. And no matter how hard she worked, how much she pushed herself, it never seemed to matter in a place where money defined your worth. But even in the face of all that, Alyssa had one thing that no one could take from her: her music. Music was her sanctuary, her escape from the world that constantly reminded her of her place. While others focused on their designer clothes or social status, Alyssa found comfort in the worn-out keys of an old church piano. She didn't need a grand piano or a prestigious tutor. She had passion, determination, and a hunger to learn. With each note, she poured her heart into the music, knowing it was the one thing that could never be taken from her. The one thing that made her feel alive in a world that often felt too small for her. In the halls of Willow Ridge, music was reserved for the elite, the children of privilege who had everything: private tutors, grand pianos, and the finest instruments money could buy. For Alyssa, however, music was a quiet rebellion, something she had claimed for herself despite the odds stacked against her. While Madison and her friends effortlessly played Beethoven and Chopin on flawless grand pianos, Alyssa had to make do with what she could find. Her piano was old, its keys chipped and worn, sitting in the corner of a quiet church. There was no teacher to guide her, no fancy music books, only a phone loaded with recordings of her favorite composers and a deep, insatiable love for the music that filled her soul. Every evening, after a long day of school, she would walk to the church, her sneakers softly echoing in the empty streets, her heart light with anticipation. She spent hours there, practicing alone in the stillness, the only sound the gentle hum of her fingers gliding over the worn keys. She would close her eyes, letting the music wash over her, feeling every note vibrate through her body, telling her story in a way words never could. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about the emotion, the connection. Music was the one thing that made her feel seen, even when the world around her chose to ignore her. At Willow Ridge, however, Alyssa knew that her passion, no matter how strong, would never measure up to the polished performances of the elite students who were born into this world of wealth and opportunity. She had no place in their world of extravagant pianos and flawless technique. Her dream, to play music on the grand stage, felt as distant as the stars. But Alyssa had something they didn't: resilience, determination, and a quiet power that none of them could understand. She might not have had the resources or the advantages, but she had the heart. And that, she knew, was enough. The day Richard Grayson, the music teacher, announced the impromptu piano performance, Alyssa's heart sank. His sharp, dry voice cut through the classroom. "I want to see you express emotion through music, not just play pieces you've memorized." To the students of Willow Ridge, it was a chance to showcase their skills, a moment to shine. And for Madison, a given. She was the golden girl, the one who had been playing piano since she could walk, the one who performed at every school event with grace and ease. But for Alyssa, it was a nightmare waiting to unfold. She hadn't prepared, didn't have the confidence the others did, and wasn't sure if her fingers could even move without trembling under the weight of the room's judgment. But Mr. Grayson's eyes were already on her, his voice cutting through the tension. "Alyssa Carter," he said, with a sly, almost amused tone, "would you like to give it a try? Or are you just used to listening to music through headphones?" The room went still, then erupted into laughter. The challenge was clear, the stakes high. Alyssa could feel the weight of every eye in the room, could hear Madison's mocking chuckle in the background. The air was thick with cruelty, every student waiting for her to fail. She could hear their laughter already in her head, the whispers of doubt, the scorn. It was so much easier to refuse, to sit quietly, to let it all pass as it always did, unnoticed. But something inside Alyssa snapped. She thought of the countless hours spent in the quiet church, practicing alone, the music her only companion. She thought of her mother's tired face, The sacrifices she made to give Alyssa a chance at a better life. This wasn't just about a performance, it was about showing the world. And more importantly, herself, that she was more than what they saw. With a deep breath, she stood. Every step she took toward the grand piano felt like it was pulling her into a space where she could no longer hide. The room seemed to close in around her. The laughter still echoing, the challenge still hanging in the air. But for the first time, Alyssa didn't shy away. She didn't hesitate. She sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. And for the first time in her life, she let go of her fear. The notes that followed weren't just sounds, they were her declaration. Her response to every doubter in the room, every sneer she'd ever faced. The moment she touched those keys, everything changed. Alyssa's fingers hovered over the piano keys, her breath shallow. But there was something different this time, something sharper, more defiant. As her hands finally made contact with the keys, the first note rang out, soft and tentative, but it held a quiet power that immediately shifted the atmosphere. The classroom fell into a stillness, the kind that only music could create. Every mocking glance, every sneer from Madison and her friends, every judgment from Mr. Grayson, all of it seemed to fade away as the delicate notes of the piano began to weave through the room like a gentle breeze. But just as she began to find her rhythm, a muffled giggle broke the silence. Like a cruel shadow stretching over her, the whispers started again, cutting into the fragile moment she was trying to create. She probably hasn't even touched a real piano. One of Madison's friends snickered. Alyssa could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the cruel laughter mingling with the quiet of the room. But she refused to let it shake her. She refused to let them steal this moment from her. Madison, lounging against her desk with a self-satisfied smirk, flicked her hair back and gave Alyssa a look that was as much a challenge as it was a dismissal. She didn't need to say anything. Just the way she crossed her legs and glanced over at her friends was enough to make Alyssa feel like the world was closing in around her. But she kept playing. Every note she played, every chord she struck, was louder than the mocking voices in her head. Her hands moved with newfound confidence, a calm strength flowing through each note. She didn't need to prove anything to Madison or Mr. Grayson. She didn't need their approval. This was about Alyssa, the girl who had spent years playing in silence, who had learned the piano not because anyone had told her she could, but because it was the only way she knew how to speak. The music wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration, a reminder to everyone in that room that she belonged. The more she played, the more the atmosphere shifted. The whispers stopped, the sneers faded into the background. Even Mr. Grayson, arms crossed and watching with skepticism, began to look less sure of himself. For the first time, the classroom was no longer filled with expectations of failure. Instead, the room held its breath, watching in awe as Alyssa Carter, the quiet girl who had been written off as invisible, transformed into someone they couldn't ignore. Each note she played carved a new path, a path that led her out of the shadows and into the light. As Alyssa played, the room seemed to fall into a profound silence. A hush so thick that it swallowed even the slightest sound. The first tentative notes, delicate yet full of intent, reverberated through the air, slowly building into something bigger, more powerful. Each note carried with it all the pain, the doubt, and the passion that had lived inside her for so long, transforming them into music that couldn't be ignored. For the first time, the students who had sneered at her, the ones who had written her off as nothing more than an outsider, began to listen. Not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Madison, who had been lounging with her typical air of superiority, sat up straighter, her usual smirk replaced by a rare look of confusion. Her sharp blue eyes widened, as if the music had torn down the walls she'd so carefully built around herself. She leaned forward, unable to take her eyes off Alyssa, her body tense with something she couldn't quite name. The other students, too, who had once mocked her, fell silent, their whispers dying as they watched in disbelief. The sound of Alyssa's fingers gliding over the keys filled the room with an emotional clarity they hadn't expected. Each note resonating with a strength they hadn't thought possible. Even Mr. Grayson, the teacher who had once looked at her with indifference, now stood still, arms uncrossed, his expression shifting. The smug certainty that had always colored his gaze was gone, replaced by something approaching surprise. He had expected her to falter, to stumble, to disappoint him as he had so many times before with students like her. But instead, Alyssa was giving them something he hadn't imagined, music that spoke with raw emotion and precision. A performance that defied the very thing he'd believed, that she didn't belong here. Alyssa didn't need to look at anyone. She didn't need validation from Madison or the others. She didn't need approval from Mr. Grayson. The music had already spoken for her, louder than any words could. She played not for them, but for herself, for the girl who had spent years practicing alone in the dark corners of her world. For the girl who had been told time and again that she wasn't good enough. She wasn't the invisible shadow anymore. With every note, she was carving out her place in this world, and no one could take it away from her. As Alyssa played, the room's atmosphere shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, but then with undeniable force. The whispers stopped, the mocking smirks faded, and the heavy tension in the air dissolved into something else, something almost reverent. Madison, who had once exuded arrogance, now sat rigid, her usual self-assurance crumbling under the weight of Alyssa's flawless performance. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, were locked on the piano keys, as if she couldn't fathom what was happening. The classmates who had sneered at her, waiting for her to stumble, were now motionless, caught in the raw beauty of the music that filled the room. Mr. Grayson, who had leaned on his usual air of superiority, stood still, his arms uncrossed for the first time. His expression, once certain of Alyssa's failure, was now replaced with something resembling confusion. He watched in stunned silence as the music grew, every note telling a story he never expected from her. Alyssa's fingers moved with growing confidence, her music flowing with an undeniable grace and emotion. The room that once buzzed with mockery was now held captive by her talent. And for the first time, Alyssa knew she was no longer the invisible girl in the back row. She had stepped into the light, and they had no choice but to listen. As the final note echoed in the room, the classroom was bathed in a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Alyssa sat there, her fingers resting gently on the piano keys, her breath steady but her heart racing with a quiet triumph. She had done it. She had shown them all. The students who had once laughed at her, who had waited for her to fail, were now frozen in disbelief. Madison, who had always been the center of attention, now sat motionless, her earlier smugness replaced by a stunned silence. Even Mr. Grayson, who had once written her off as insignificant, stood still, his face betraying the realization that Alyssa had far surpassed his expectations. The room, once filled with mockery, was now silent, the weight of her performance settling over them like a heavy blanket. Alyssa didn't need their applause or approval. She had already proven everything she needed to prove. She had silenced the doubts, the judgment, and most of all, herself. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged, and no one could take that away from her.